As the sun sank lower into the west, and the last of the warm afternoon rays left my face in a shadow, I felt the cold creeping up my arms. I could just make out the ominous black clouds swirling in the distance, like great ghostly ballet dancers, stretching their claw-like tendrils across the closing of the day. The last of the sun's rays disappeared into the black oblivion, and the slight breeze suddenly whipped up to strong gusts, pulling at my hair and clothes like bony fingers, as I stood on the porch. I turned and entered the house then, and gladly closed the front door behind me with an ominous creak, hoping my partner Bran, who had gone to a meeting, would not take too long. His meetings were very secretive and he would never discuss them with me. I assumed they were for work. I didn't like this dark feeling which made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a chill run down my spine. Having changed into my pajamas and robe, I settled down on the large squishy couch with my book, and my small dog snuggled in beside me. Outside, the gales began to rattle the door, and roared through the trees. I could hear things being tossed around, and then the rain began. Just lightly at first, like a cool summer shower on a ghastly hot day, and I hoped this was a sign that the storm was blowing away. How wrong I was. The rain got heavier, much heavier. It pelted against the roof and the windows with a roar so loud, I was sure the glass would come crashing into the house at any moment. The branches of the trees were scratching at the windows, intent on getting inside. It was hard to concentrate, but I kept my mind on the pages of the book in my hand, even though the words were swimming before my eyes. My dog had disappeared behind the couch, cowering from fright. Suddenly the door rattled, at last. I thought Bran had finally arrived back. Or had he? I waited as the knob started to turn. I expected him to walk through the door, but the door stayed shut and the knob kept turning, slowly, ever so slowly. I forced myself off the couch, and on unsteady feet crept to the front door, with my heart pounding in my chest. The door was being rocked by the rain and wind as I peered through the glass panel. It was so black it was hard to make out anything, just wavering shadows with bursts of light from the storm, but I could just make out the outline of the front gate, blowing back and forth like the sails of a ship. My heart leapt into my mouth and I stifled my scream as a black shadowy figure passed by, outside the front door, long flowing hair being whipped up by the gales as it stood there, and then, as I stared, with my mouth open in horror, it was gone again. I backed away from the door, heart pounding, chills running up and down my spine. Who or what was that? But as scared as I was, my curiosity overruled me. I had to find out or I would never be able to settle down again. Pulling my robe around me as tight as possible, I pulled the front door open, and was almost knocked over by the wind and rain. I forced myself forward and pushed out onto the porch and into the black night. The outside light had blown, and I didn't have a spare. As my eyes adjusted to the dim, I started to look around. There was a sudden violent crack of lightning, which lit up the whole sky. As my hair blew around my face and whipped at my eyes, it came into view. There, standing on the rail at the end of the porch, was an enormous black cat, green eyes shining in the night, tail swishing and hair standing up like pine needles along its back. There was a low burbling growl emanating from the creature. Panic spread over me. It looked so menacing. I wondered where it had come from and why it was there, but it was just a cat. I told myself not to be stupid. It was probably just as scared as I was in this abysmal storm. I started towards it, but it let out a terrified scream and leapt towards me, claws aiming at my face. I tried to jump out of the way, but felt the scrape of its claws down the side of my face, as hot blood ran down my neck. It soared over the rail, off the porch, and into the blackness. I was drenched, shivering, and in shock. I headed back to the front door, only to hear a low growl and then a hiss from behind me. I turned around too quickly, skidding on the wet veranda and falling hard on my hip. As I lurched back onto my feet, I saw a large black shadow with long trailing hair disappear around the end of the porch. I raced inside and slammed the door shut, almost shattering the glass panel, and leant against it to get my breath back and stop my thumping heart. But someone was there, pushing the door open against me. I backed away, my eyes standing out of my head, my heart jumping out of my chest, as the knob turned and the front door slowly opened. Bran stood outside the door, dripping wet, his long dark hair plastered to his face and his green eyes feverishly bright in the half-light. He told me his car had broken down, and he had been trying to call me. "Why didn't you answer your phone, and what the hell have you done to your face? Have you been out in that storm? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain what I had seen, but he laughed at me, so I didn't try any further. The next day the man from the auto shop called around with the car. He handed me the keys to my husband's car and started to laugh. "I don't know what your husband did, but all that was wrong was that he had flooded the engine. I would have thought after so many years of driving he would have known how to start it. Strange thing is, he called on his mobile for us to pick the car up, just a mile down the road. When we got there he was nowhere to be seen, and the keys were left in the car." "Exactly what time do you think that was?" I asked. When he told me, I realized it was the same time I was out on the veranda. "Terrible storm last night," I remarked. "A few locals have told me they saw strange things, but I guess it was probably just the dark night and the storm, playing tricks with the light. It's all gone now, so guess we'll never know." He laughed at me, and then remarked on the scratch on my cheek. "Oh, that, I accidentally slipped over on the wet veranda last night and scratched myself on a splinter. Did you know another bad storm is predicted next week?" I asked him. As I said the words, my heart started to beat loudly in my chest. My husband had told me they were very busy at the lodge where he worked and he would need to go to another meeting the following week. Why did I have a feeling there was something connected between my husband and what had happened the night of the storm? The scratch on my cheek got very red and sore, my temperature soared, and I spent a day in bed having strange nightmares. The doctor came to look at me, put some weird green gel on the scratch, and stood whispering to Bran in the doorway. The next day the scratch was almost gone and I was up and about and feeling great. "What did the doctor have to say?" I asked Bran. He glared at me for a few seconds, then smiled. "Oh, just to make sure you feel okay for the next few days, that scratch was a little bit infected, but should be right now. You have to promise me you won't do anything silly again, like going outside in the middle of a storm. You are just lucky you didn't knock yourself unconscious when you slipped over." "But Bran, I told you it was enough. I don't want to hear any more of your insane stories." With that he left for work. I was convinced he knew a lot more about the cat than he was letting on. I wasn't looking forward to the storm which was predicted the following week. As I pass by the city of Heliopolis, my fascination of the famous Baron Palace grows more and more. It is a place where you can find the meeting point of the East and the West. It is the mixture of two different architectural types, the outer statues and the fence belonging to Renaissance style, and the chateau, with a high dome decorated with statues of the Buddha gilded with gold and platinum, inspired by the Hindu temples of Orissa in India and Angkor Wat in Cambodia. On the outside, the palace is carved with the reliefs of Hindu gods like Krishna, Hanuman, Vishnu, and Garuda. The walls inside is also painted with scenes from Hindu mythology, and the doors had real gold knobs. Its surreal effect fills me with terror and admiration. One day, I decide to enter the palace, despite of the rumors. To make the adventure more intriguing, I decide to enter the house at 11 p.m. I enter the chateau. To my surprise, it is small and consists of only 2 floors topped by a roof. Despite that, it is like a maze full of a spiral staircase and an elevator that connects all the palace floors with a basement. First, I see terraced garden full of the statues of Ganesha and Nigas. Then, I enter the basement. It contains a group of rooms connected by corridors and doors, marble washtubs and an elevator made of nutmeg wood that connects the basement to the first floor. On the first floor, there is the dining room with its walls ornamented with copies of paintings by Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci and Rembrandt. An elevator ornamented with small Hindu statues takes me to the second floor, which contains several bedrooms each with its own bathroom walled with mosaic tiles. Another elevator of fine tulip wood leads to the roof, where Baron Impane held parties. Finally, the roof of the palace comes as an open space on one of the sides of the tower. The tower itself is another story. It is said that the tower was built on a revolving base that rotates by the hour so that it follows the direction of the sun, moving from east to west. It was built in a way that allows a 360-degree view, constant sunlight and a changing view without moving. The rotating tower is like a temple shikara where Baron had his rooms. Especially, the Forbidden Room, the room that Baron prevented anyone from entering, even his daughter and his sister. Beneath this room are underground chambers, from which a tunnel is said to lead to his mausoleum in his nearby Catholic basilica. My curiosity completely controls me. A voice in my head allures me to see the room. The temptation is irresistible and my desire is unstoppable. I enter the room, and I see the painting of the Temptation of Buddha by Mara. Something strange about it. It is the only room that is not lit by the sun. There is a door decorated with statues of Hindu deities, mythical creatures and elephants. I open the door. Everything looks normal. While I am about to leave, the clock strikes midnight. Then, doom begins. The mirror becomes a fountain of blood. The sound of moving furniture. Lights going on and off. Windows open and close at will. Smoke is coming out of nowhere. Then I faint. As I open my eyes, I find myself in a grandeur party. The outfits of the people are like those of 1910. I think it is a Halloween party. But, wait a minute. Why do all people wear the same style? Then, the clock strikes midnight. Is the clock going backward? Something is not right. The only thing I remember is being in this crazy room. Who carried me to the garden? There is a huge, handwritten poster. How old-fashioned it is. Again the voice tempts me to read this sign. Then I faint. It is, or was I do not know, the opening of the palace in 1911. Am I dreaming or it is just the bloody room? What is going on? My heart beats faster and faster, and my breath becomes harder and harder. After a while I finally find enough courage to enter the palace again. Yet I hear some noise outside the palace. There are poor people asking for food as they know that after the party the food will be thrown in the trash. Their empty stomachs crying out for the food. Their outfit sparks the contrast between the hardship of life and the luxury of life. Two familiar scenes occur throughout the history. The history is always shaped by two binary opposites, good versus evil, and the poor versus the rich. But the wheel of fortune and the will of man together change everything. The Baron himself was once a man of modest origin who climbed the ladder of the social hierarchy. Impane had made his fortune building railway lines in Belgium and France, and had masterminded the construction of the Paris metro. He spent his life just to build his masterpiece. Then I see a beautiful angel, the Baron's sister, Helena. She wears a beautiful, white dress, like a Greek goddess. Yet her eyes speak in silent language and tell the story of tremendous suffering and loneliness. Her wretched life is because of her brother's epilepsy, his rigid firmness, and her silent life. She lives in complete darkness and silence. I decide to talk to her to try to comfort her. I approach her and start talking, but she does not respond back. Then a man talks to her and she responds back. I am ashamed and angry at the same time. I start shouting, but no reaction. I am invisible. Then it strikes midnight again. Now there is no party. It is a normal day. I got used to seeing Helena alone in the rotating tower. But this time is different. She goes to the roof after a fierce fight with her brother. She and her brother finally open the old wound. You destroyed my life. You left me utterly wounded. I loved the poor fellow, that you squashed me like an ant, said Helena. He does not fit us now. Look at us now. I am a baron. You are a baroness. Act accordingly, said the baron coldly. You were poor once. Can't you remember? Money does not make men, nor love. He was my light and you turned it off, hysterically said Helena. What is done can't be undone. You need to live with it. This is your only option, said the baron. With a stream of tears, Helena hurries to her favorite spot, her balcony. She always talks to the stars, as they are the only one who can listen to her. They never judge her, nor break her heart. She is near the statue of Mara at the fence of her balcony. Suddenly, the tower moves violently as if it were an earthquake. She scrambles and is about to fall from the top of the tower. She clings to the statue to save her from death. She keeps calling her brother to save her, but he turns a deaf ear to her. Her hand cannot hold her any longer and fail to save her. She is dead. Since that time the gears of the rotating tower have been dysfunctional. I think that the palace is under a curse. There are some fights heard in the palace, between the baron and the spirit of his sister. The baron himself succumbs to regular seizures in the gardens of his palace. No one dares to touch him or help him. Sometimes I hear him speaking to his sister's ghost. He begs the ghost of his sister to forgive him, but it turns a deaf ear to him. It is too late now. Life gives him many chances, but his ego lets them go. Man seems to listen to his voice only, and to listen to the voice of wisdom after suffering from his sense of guilt. Then, his wife is dead in the palace. This wife's death deepens the pain of his daughter Miriam. Earlier in her life, she caught polio. Rather than comforting her, the baron treats her so cruelly, as if she smeared his reputation by a scandalous act. Then, she is plagued by depression and secludes herself in a basement room in the tower. Her psychological problem haunts her down. I hear her screams and suffering. I hear her often speaking to the ghost of her aunt. It always seems that the only one who understands women's feelings is a woman. Because of a simple thing, they always experience the same. Each woman is at the beginning a prisoner to something or someone. Some of them breaks the chain and opens the door, and some of them sits helplessly and silently in a prison. Miriam is just a woman curbing her feelings and living in utter silence. Eventually, she manages to heal herself with the help of her aunt's ghost. She is now in a better mood. She is alive again, as if her isolation was her revival. Her full moon shines and purifies her soul. One day, she is on the roof of the tower enjoying the moonless sky. Then, the clock strikes midnight. A loud scream is heard. Later, she was found dead under the elevator, with no one knowing why. In her tombstone, they wrote, "She is like the full moon. She is like the life's tune. Here comes her high noon. Then, the rays of the sun wake me up." Though the sun never reaches this gloomy room, it found a way to enter. I see now the painting of Buddha more clearly now. I run like lightning from this cave-like palace to see the light. There is only one question that puzzles me: if the Baron had the chance of escaping his cave, how the story would be ended. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked. Brad laughed. I didn't. Then my car broke down, my phone died at the same time, and you came out of nowhere about 2 seconds later. "You're not a ghost, are you?" She smiled rather than answering, making his heart race in a mix of fear and excitement. Her eyes shone in the glow of the streetlight, impossibly large. Teenage boys fall in love over the most fleeting of things, but those eyes went on forever. Then she looked away. In a voice he could barely hear, she asked, "If I were a ghost, would you leave me?" "No," he said. The word passed his lips so fast that the sound of it startled him. "I'd hoped you'd say that," she told him, sounding relieved. She leaned closer and wrapped both her arms around one of his the way girls did with their boyfriends between classes. The sleeves of her tan jacket rustled as she moved. She was small enough to rest her head against his biceps. Her touch pressed the inside of his coat against his skin, a startling reminder of the evening chill. "Cold," she said into his sleeve. "Is your place far?" She shook her head. "But this part of town worries me at night. People don't know me, and if they don't know you in the city, then you're in danger." That caused Brad to glance around at the darkened windows. Tenement homes rose along both sides of the street. It was past midnight, but it seemed odd that not one building had a light burning. He thought of his dead car and cell phone. Like an EMP went off and everything electronic is fried. As if in consent to his fantasy, a street light winked out as they walked under it. "That always happens to me," she said with a wistful laugh. "Me too," Brad said. "My whole life." He laughed again, wishing it didn't sound nervous. "If they don't know you in the city, then you're in danger." He was a long way from his parents' home in the suburbs, and he was an hour past curfew. Dad would not be pleased, but Brad might be able to earn some grace if he came home with a story about helping this poor girl home. She was his age and alone after midnight. How could he leave her like this? Unlikely to save him from being grounded for a week, but stranger things had happened. It wasn't impossible that Dad might listen, give him one of those quietly proud half-smiles that brightened his eyes, and just leave it at that. They walked together under the next few humming lights, which did not turn off. Brad scanned ahead but still detected no windows illuminated. The only light came from the glare above, which blotted out stars but fell short of banishing the shadows that filled the occasional alley. "Don't look," she said, hurrying him from sidewalk to sidewalk where one building ended and its twin began. Brad obeyed without question. He focused on the path ahead and how much he did not want her to let go of him. Peripherally, though, he spotted movement in the darkness of the alley. In driver's ed, Mr. Worth had said, "The light you get from your sodium street lamps doubles peripheral vision and helps pedestrians to avoid tripping." Brad didn't get a good look, but whatever was in the alley was too tall to be an animal. They didn't get bears in the city, but not quite right for a big man either. Her feet came down on the sidewalk in front of the next tenement just ahead of his own. Then her cheek was against his arm again. He didn't bother to glance back. "Thank you again for walking me," she said. "No problem," he said. "I'm not from around here either." "You're kind of walking me, too." "I like that," she said and squeezed his arm tighter. She still felt cold. Brad's breath formed clouds when he exhaled. It had been in the low 60s earlier today, but in autumn temperatures plummeted after sundown. He considered offering her his jacket, but she set a brisk pace and showed no interest in slowing. Her tan jacket was worn in places, but it would shelter her till they got where they were going. She would be home soon, and she wouldn't want to stop to wait for him to take off his coat when she was already wearing one. The darkened apartments continued to slumber around them. 2 streetlights winked out across the road, one just ahead of where they stood, the other just behind. In front of them stretched more identical tenements. They could be the same one repeated over and over, and then darkness, as if the road ambled off into nothing. There were no lots ahead. Brad narrowed his eyes. There were also no stoplights, which meant no major cross streets. Just unlit, but maybe not empty, alleyways between buildings. Why did she have to get me thinking about ghosts? "You're not from around here?" he asked. She shook her head, rubbing her cheek against his sleeve. She made a muffled sound that might have meant anything. "Where are you from?" "Providence," she said after a moment. Then she giggled. It was a brief, chiding sound that did nothing to put Brad at ease. It was the sound girls made when they got a joke that you didn't even realize had been made. "Are you here visiting family?" She shrugged. Brad nodded as if he understood. They came to another alley, 2 brick walls stretching into a darkness the streetlights could not penetrate. She gripped his arm and rushed forward. He kept pace easily enough. The alley might have watched them pass, but he glimpsed nothing within, even with double his usual peripheral vision due to the lights overhead. "Where did you say you were going?" he asked. "Up there," she said. Then she looked up again, big eyes full of emotion. "Thank you again for walking me." "Sure," he said, thinking that there was more than a joke here that he wasn't getting. She leaned closer, looping her arm around his waist in the overly familiar way of some girls that never paid much attention to kids like Brad. She shivered against him. His arm was around her, protective, before the realization of what he was doing could make him stop. The top of her dark hair, scents of perfume and shampoo mingled, brushed his chin. He breathed deep. "I wish my car hadn't broken down," he said. "We could be there by now. You never would have seen me." Brad laughed nervously again. They were coming up on another alley, which meant another block lay behind them. The streetlight on the far side was asleep, throwing the space between into deeper shadow. Something about the broader swath of darkness struck him as menacing. She hesitated, feeling the same. "This is crazy," he said. "I don't even know your name." "Constance," she said. Brad introduced himself in turn, and she giggled again without looking up. What might have come across as shy from another girl instead left him uneasy. Was she laughing at him? It's not like she could have known his name already. They'd only met 3 blocks back. "What brought you here from Providence?" "Hurry," she exclaimed. She dropped her hands to his own, sandwiching his between both of hers and pulling him along at a run. Brad let out a surprised cry, both at the shocking strength with which she tugged him and the realization of just how cold she was. Her touch burned the flesh on both the front and back of his hand. They raced past the alley, and beneath the sleeping sodium light, she just a flash of tan jacket in the darkness, not stopping until they stood beneath the next burning lamp. The light pulled around them in a tight circle. It felt safe to Brad, but Constance peered about, still afraid. He followed her gaze and thought he understood. Many lights flickered and snapped out. The next cone of light pierced the darkness half a block away. The gulf between seemed impenetrable. Even the tenement walls and windows appeared indistinct beyond the veil of darkness. What, he started to ask, but the light overhead flickered, and she again took him by the hand. They ran. This time he worked to keep up. She must run track, he thought, and realized that she was still gaining speed. In the Olympics. "Don't look," she shouted, fear bold in her voice. Faster now, threatening to pull away if Brad didn't manage to put on more speed than ever before. He wanted to call out, to ask what was wrong, but it took all he had just to keep up. The sidewalk sped beneath him. If a foot came down wrong at this speed, he would roll an ankle and tumble like a kid hitting a pothole going downhill on a bicycle. He brought his eyes up from the ground, focusing on the flickering light ahead. He could see just one more streetlight beyond it, small but steady in the distance. The more he trained his eyes on it, though, the more he began to notice things moving at the edges of his vision. Things that had begun to take notice of the two people running down their street. Things that rose, but not like men. They loomed. Half seen, they gave the impression of distorted limbs, disproportionate hands, eyes like craters and mouths like chasms, all darker than the night in which they dwelled. Worst of all, they looked familiar. "Don't look." Constance reached the light post and stumbled to a halt. The light held steady, providing a constricted but well-lighted space. "What is going on?" Brad asked. His breath came out in a puff of vapor, but his lungs were not burning. He tried to meet Constance's eyes, but she stared ahead, toward the last small light in the distance. "She's there." Constance gasped. She grabbed his hand again, and in the instant before her icy fingers closed over his palm, Brad saw that his flesh where she had touched him was black. They ran together for the last time, pell-mell across the yards spanning the exhausted lights whose glare no longer put the stars into retreat. Past the spaces between tenements where no creature of morning stirred. Brad did not look directly into the dark gaps. He sensed that Constance's warning might be key to his survival, but he knew that the denizens of this place were no longer just taking notice. They closed in on their flanks. He sensed what Constance was hoping. The light could keep them at bay. He prayed she was right. "She's there," Brad thought. A figure stood in the cone of light ahead of them. A woman in a coarse yellow coat, hood drawn up. She held an umbrella of the same hue as her coat. It seemed impossible that he might have missed her before, but there she was. Brad focused on her, a muted sun shining beneath the street lamp. He made her his destination. If the woman was drawing Constance, then she could draw him, too. As before, his effort to focus on the woman ahead of them resulted in the bizarre effect of making the half-seen things around them stand out clearer. The more he tried not to see them, the more prominent they became. They stood close enough to stretch out a grotesquely long, thin arm and grab either Constance or him. Brad began to cry out, a long, ululating utterance that was the slow, horrible birth of a scream. In his efforts not to peek left or right, he began to notice movement above and below. The sidewalk writhed beneath his feet. He refused to look down, which left him with the haunting impression that the concrete flowed beneath him like a river full of water snakes. The sky above danced with lights. Some desperate, rational part of his mind, grasping at sanity, linked these lights to an airplane coming down to land. He glanced up as they crossed into the cone of light, just enough time to see eyes staring back, bloodshot, weeping viscous tears. The glare of the lamp overhead obliterated his view of sky and street. Sound remained, the splashing of large raindrops hitting the pavement. Teardrops. He shuddered. Brad opened his mouth again but found no words. He realized that, despite having run the length of a football field since the last circle of light, and also several blocks before that, his breath came easily. He moved to look back the way they had come, but Constance placed a hand on his shoulder. Cold penetrated his body. He no longer attributed it to the autumn evening. The woman in the yellow coat, Brad thought. Why was she so hard to remember? She stood before them, but he didn't recall seeing her when they had arrived just a few seconds earlier. He had the wild idea that she had flickered the way the streetlights had done. Only the lamp above them now remained steady. He thought of Constance's expression earlier when he asked her where she was going, as if she had known the direction but not how far. "I brought him," Constance said. The woman inclined her head, obscured by the hood of her coat. Brad saw her chin, which curved to an angle, lips pressed into a fine line that showed neither favor nor displeasure, the hint of an aquiline nose. She extended the hand that held the umbrella. There were animals printed on it. Ravens. Owls. Sparrows. "I don't understand," he said. "Take it," Constance told him. "It wasn't your fault. When I found out, I asked to come back for you." Abrupt disorientation stirred memories. Brad recalled the moments before his car broke down. Lost and driving through a part of the city he did not recognize. People everywhere, but all of them were distorted, as if seen through funhouse glass. They warped and changed as he watched. Terrified, he had reached for his phone, but it writhed in his hand. It had hissed. That was when one particular figure in a tan coat ran in front of the car. He tried to brake, but the car went faster. Veered into metal and glass. He looked at Constance. She watched him, her bottomless eyes welling with pity. "My car didn't break down." She shook her head. "It was you." The corners of her mouth ticked upward a little. "When you get there, you learn so much. I found out about your friends, and that you only had one drink. It wasn't even alcoholic. You didn't know they put something in it." "When you get there?" he asked. She did not respond. "Oh." She gestured to the umbrella. "Please take it. This isn't the right place for you. They said I could bring you home." "That means Brad's voice faltered. "I must have." She reached out again, as if to caress his cheek, stopped short. She said, more urgently now, "It's all right. I forgive you. If you could have, you would have stopped. It would have been you taking me home." Brad reeled. He could feel his scalp beneath his hair. Memories danced, spider-like, they hovered just out of reach. The realization of what he had done to this poor young woman, because he was hurrying home so Dad wouldn't be pissed about curfew, because of a Coke and whatever had been added to it, all of it was too much. Something in his expression frightened Constance. "Wait," she said. "Brad, stop." He looked at the umbrella, still held with the curved handle towards him. The handle was of some white stone, pearl, that he should not have recognized. Engraved in the stone was a name, Providence. Memories began to form in his head that weren't his. They crowded the ones that should have been there. When you get there, you learn so much. But his new memories could not drive out the understanding that the last thing he had done in his 17 years of life was take away the future from what had to be the sweetest young woman on the planet. He backed away from the umbrella. The woman holding it would soon flicker away. He sensed that if he waited that long, then he would have waited too long. She would not return. "Brad, please," Constance said, but he could not hear over the roar of his guilt. He had been a good son, had hoped to be a good man. He was the sort of person who would pick up a hitchhiker and take her home, even if curfew was already behind him. She was pleading now. He heard something about their fates being connected by her choice. More that he didn't understand. He glanced at her tear-streaked face, and he could not bear to look upon her. He did not deserve to go where she had been. He could not bear to be forgiven. Shaking his head, Brad turned his back on the proffered umbrella. The woman in the yellow coat vanished, but he was no longer looking to see it. Constance screamed as he ran into the darkened city streets, beneath the weeping eyes and into the warped, grasping hands. He ran into his self-ordained punishment, leaving her to collapse and sob in the last circle of light in a benighted landscape.